Ansin to temtik tatam skarna agaki o me kan mohte on sigas on maskotsi sigotse. Nigan xementon naskma hinamago ahkutak kiska. Mistake gootse. Timamopiak. Good afternoon. I'm Willie Littlechild from the Muscogees territory, speaking to you from Italy, the traditional territory of the Vatican. And we're here, of course, on a very specific mission to invite the Pope to come to Canada. So my apologies for not being there with you in person. However, the topic we want to discuss today are the Sustainable Development Goals that have been adopted by the United Nations and indeed the globe, the whole world. The specific questions are, how does this impact First Nations and how can we participate as First Nations? But before I begin with that, I want to go back a little bit to the historical background. When the United Nations proclaimed they were going to adopt a set of Millennium Development Goals, we were completely excluded from that. And then a few years later, when they decided to create a business and human rights forum, again, we were excluded. So what we've done as Indigenous peoples is we took an Indigenous lens and looked at each of the Millennium Development Goals and made them changed them, to our perspective. Had we participated, what would those Millennium Development Goals look like? Likewise with the business and human rights. We took an Indigenous lens and went principle by principle and then looked at it from our perspective in business and human rights. Each of the principles, how would they have been stated had we been able to participate as Indigenous peoples? So that's the background. We've been excluded twice. And I'm starting now recently because, as you all know, we were excluded before that since 1923 till 1948, and then 1974 finally we started getting a voice internationally. But one of the challenges we still have is that we're not able to fully participate at the United Nations as Indigenous peoples representing our own treaties, our own territories, our own nations. So that's an ongoing discussion. But these development goals that have been adopted are quite significant because every one of them, I think, touches on Indigenous matters. And I want to give a quick overview of the goals themselves and the agenda. And of course, the story begins with the adoption of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples back in 2007. And in 2015, the UN decided to adopt these Sustainable Development Goals based on the previous Millennium Development Goals. So it was a very difficult challenge for us to try to get input into the Sustainable Development Goals from our perspective. I remember being in New York and going many nights late into the evening and sometimes into the morning, debating with states why we should be included in these Sustainable Development Goals. Because for one thing, I believe our people our elders, traditional hunters, traditional leaders, they know best how to take care of Mother Earth. They know best how to develop something in a sustainable way in terms of protecting and still developing in a balanced way the economic ventures, for example. So when we look at the development goals, there are, for example, the first one is no poverty. Well, no poverty, of course, is a very direct categorization of a lofty goal for many indigenous peoples, tribes, and nations because of the poverty that exists in some of our communities. And yet, on the other hand, we're very rich in terms of culture, tradition, and knowledge. So that's the first goal. The second one is zero hunger. And again, I think over the years, because of the change of diet among our peoples, it created health problems for us. For example, as you know, with the residential school history, the number one killer was indeed tuberculosis. And that was because we were forced to change our nutritional diets, where we were very healthy and didn't have these current medical challenges. Even the one that's pandemic, because previously there was an endemic in our indigenous peoples. Some of them were died because of that, because of the change of food habits that we had. Thirdly, good health and well-being. Well, that's a very important goal again for us. We need to be of good health. And I think I like how the Spanish brothers and sisters say well-being in their language. When they say well-being in their language, it reverses the expression. They say being well instead of well-being. And being well means from a holistic perspective, like you've seen the medicine wheel, but in this case, being well physically, mentally, culturally, and very importantly, spiritually. So that's a goal that really relates to us. The fourth one is quality education. And some communities have taken over their own education systems, their own curricula. And now we're starting to see and begin to see what quality education looks like and the impact it has in our communities. Gender equality, an ongoing concern by many indigenous peoples because of the two-spirit peoples that we have in our culture that have been excluded and criticized and marginalized for years. But gender equality in terms of all aspects, whether it's employment, whether it's leadership, that's an impact on us. One that is currently a very serious challenge, which is the sixth Sustainable Development Goal, which is clean water and sanitation. As you know, we still have many boil your water instructions, many communities, and the sanitary system is not necessarily healthy. So that's a big challenge. So that impacts us. And when you go to the affordable and clean energy, some people, some tribes, nations have been switching to different forms of energy and consequently have saved money, for example, and yet were able to provide the energy they need for their community, their nation, and for their members. Decent work and economic growth. We've said many times, our population, the largest population of unemployed peoples, is actually the biggest pool of talent that's being excluded by others by leaving us out of employment opportunities. The ninth goal is industry, innovation, and infrastructure. Again, when you look at our communities in terms of infrastructure, everyone knows how many thousands of homes were behind across the country when it comes to housing, when it comes to infrastructure, whether it's bridges or roads. They're not necessarily the quality that they need to be for our safety. Reducing inequalities, again, as a goal, is a noble goal, because the very reason we have the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was not only because we've been always marginalized or neglected or not allowed into the meetings. Now, because of the adoption of the UN Declaration, the three first articles are about equality. For example, under international law, those laws apply to us in equal ways now as human beings. The right to self-determination applies now equally. So the necessity of having the declaration to catch up to the rest of the world was important and is an ongoing goal from the global context. Sustainable cities and communities, from a different perspective, some of the challenges our people have in the urban situation is because there's a shortage of housing in their own community, or they want a job and they're forced to move into an urban situation, and sometimes get into difficult circumstances that translates into homelessness or various addictions. So that's a goal, again, that speaks to us directly. The responsible consumption and production, our people are very expert in taking only what you need. For example, when you're young, you're taught to be a hunter, but only to take enough of what the community needs so that you can feed your elders, you can take care of those that are sick first, or the children, and then you share the rest. So that's a direct contribution that we could offer to the global community. A current goal was actually introduced by our people, our elders at the United Nations, and that's the concern about climate change. When the late Morris Strong came to us to ask what he could do, because he was appointed the chairperson for the first Rio Summit on the Environment, he came to our elders and he said, "What should I do?" And of course the response was, make sure the elders are present at that meeting so that the world can begin to know about our traditional knowledge on how to deal with climate change. Life below the water. I remember an old man saying at the UN, "Which one of you is going to argue for my brother, the fish that swims in the waters? Who among you is going to argue for the four-leggeds, our brothers and sisters, so that we can live?" And then economic perspective of environment started being discussed, but first it would be our brothers and sisters, the birds that fly in the airs, the fish that swim in the waters, the four-leggeds, and also who among you is going to argue for clean air and clean water? And why I'm here in the traditional territory of the Vatican in Italy is for that very reason. His Holiness Pope Francis has a very great concern about climate change. So when you listen to him talk about the protection of Mother Earth, he speaks like one of our elders. And life on the land, again, who are the experts about life on the land? Taking care of the land properly, offering tobacco blessings, to ask for permission before you can cut a tree, for example, because that tree provides oxygen for us from the rain so that we can breathe. So life on the land in terms of respect and balanced development, it's our people that are experts. Peace and justice and strong institutions. Well, our treaties are peace agreements. We're the ones who offered to share our territories in the treaty agreements and the adhesions subsequent to the treaties. So sharing in a peaceful way, seeking justice, peaceful coexistence through strong institutions is something that impacts us very directly and again can offer the world a contribution. And the last one, the 17th one, is about partnerships and the goals. And just as we said with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, when we talk about reconciliation, it's going to take all of us working together towards reconciliation, for true reconciliation to happen, now that we know what the truth is. So the third element I was asked to talk about, that was a quick overview on the development goals, but what did we try to achieve by participating finally at the discussions on the Sustainable Development Goals? We advocated for, of course, a rights-based approach based on the minimum standards of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and also with full participation in the meetings. Free, prior, and informed consent must be affirmed in all stages, whether it's planning, implementation, monitoring, or evaluation. We need to be there at the table. I remember one of our famous elders saying that if you're not at the table participating, you can bet your money you're on the menu. So these are areas where we need to be participating. So we advocated for that. We advocated for the protection of land and resource rights. We advocated for traditional livelihoods and knowledge and food sovereignty. We advocated for culture to be the fourth pillar of sustainable development, because there are three pillars and we wanted to argue for the fourth to be culture, because when you look at the UN Declaration, for example, there's over 30 references to culture in the UN Declaration. So it's very significant and should be included whenever there's talk about sustainable development. In the 2030 agenda, the theme was transforming our world. It was adopted by the UN General Assembly in September of 2015, but the revelation of that, and why I mention that, is now there are 6 references in the Sustainable Development Goals because of what we lobbied for in our participation at the meetings. The first mention is 1 in 3, empowerment, engagement, and education of Indigenous peoples. Those need to be in the Sustainable Development Goals, and they are. They're in fact paragraphs 23, 25, and 52. Ending hunger, to end hunger, is something we advocated for, and it's in the goals now, but it was specific to Indigenous peoples because we're also experts in agriculture. We know how to have proper food, nutrition, and that's actually the second Sustainable Development Goal. To ensure access to education for Indigenous peoples, that's the 4th Sustainable Development Goal. So we did succeed in a way by being at the table. Education is also a target, clause 4.5. And lastly, and very importantly, the 6th mention is that Indigenous peoples' participation in follow-up and review of these goals. And that's in paragraph 79. So we succeeded in getting 6 references into the Sustainable Development Goals. But there are other goals and targets that address Indigenous priorities, like our priorities here in Turtle Island or North America. First one, of course, is human rights, because we've been excluded for so long. So the targets about human rights need to include us, especially our right to participation. As I said, we don't have that right yet. We're still arguing for that. Environmental protection, climate change, biodiversity, oceans, waters, lands, and forests. These are all areas that are our duty to safeguard, and we did advocate for them. Also, poverty and hunger reduction. And we do that by growing our own traditional foods in our own gardens, with the seed diversity that we have. And in a way, it's a small-scale agriculture. But in our treaty making here, one of the reasons that agriculture was mentioned was the attempt to make us from subsistence hunters and gatherers to be agricultural peoples in terms of becoming farmers. And many did, and many have succeeded in doing that. Access to Social Security, health, and education is a goal. Overcoming discrimination, inequality, and conflicts. There is a conflict resolution mechanism right within the UN Declaration when you look at a cluster of 3 articles. And we have our own traditional ways of conflict resolution. So when we talk about the 2030 Agenda theme of transforming our world, we're in the areas that I just mentioned, the 6 areas that are very critical to the inclusion of our priorities. And also the question we asked ourselves when we looked at the 6 areas that we succeeded, we asked, what's missing? What's missing in the Sustainable Development Goals? Well, there's no mention of indigenous peoples' lands and resource rights. There's no mention of our collective rights and our traditional knowledge. And very importantly, self-determination through treaty rights and free, prior, and informed consent. These are ongoing challenges, but as we go forward with your work, with your expertise, I'm sure you'll succeed for all of us to make sure that we're involved in monitoring and implementing the Sustainable Development Goals, both at the country level and at the UN levels, to address these shortfalls that are not there and are not being protected today. So this whole area, when the Danish Institute of Human Rights in 2016 looked at it, they came to a very important conclusion. The 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda consists of 17 goals. Yes, we've just gone through them, but there are 169 targets. It's also, of which 92% are linked to human rights. 73% of the Sustainable Development Goals, which is 169, have substantial links to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples or the ILO Convention 169 on Indigenous and Tribal Peoples' rights. So what's missing? We have work to do there. The existing 17 goals, 2030 agenda, all impact us. The key is going to have to be our participation from here on going forward. The first time Sustainable Development Goals was mentioned internationally was at the ILO, the International Labour Organization. When we amended Convention 107 to what is now Convention 169 in 1989, Article 7 of the Convention reads that ILO 169 recognizes that Indigenous peoples have the right to decide their own priorities for the process of development as it affects their lives, beliefs, institutions, and spiritual well-being, and also the lands they occupy or otherwise use. That's the first time in an international legal instrument sustainable development is mentioned. It's in Article 7 of the ILO Convention 169. Furthermore, the ILO Convention requires states to fully consult with Indigenous peoples and to ensure informed participation in decisions pertaining to development, national institutions, programs, cultural protections, and lands and resources. So those two important concepts from our people that we tried to get into the ILO Convention from 107 to 169, in fact, are there now in Articles 2, 6, 16, 27, and 33. So we succeeded early, in a sense, in 1989 by convincing the ILO that sustainable development of and by Indigenous peoples needs to be included. Then later on, the UN Declaration was adopted. And as you all know, it affirms the right to development. Article 3 of the UN Declaration: indigenous peoples have the right of self-determination, and by virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. And that's the foundation of the UN Declaration, and it's also the foundation for sustainable development. As we go forward, we always need to be mindful of that. Another aspect our people brought to the UN was on inherent rights, and the Declaration defines in a good way what does it mean, inherent right. Kikpakngosuan, tansan may tagite gogo, tansan may mstotama kiano. Inherent rights, and I quote, recognizing the urgent need to respect and promote the inherent rights of indigenous peoples, which derive from their political, economic, and social structures, and from their cultures, their spiritual traditions, histories, and philosophies, especially their rights to their lands, territories, and resources. And that's a preambular paragraph from the UN Declaration, but it also is a very comprehensive definition of what inherent rights means, close to how our elders talk about it. But it also affirms harmonious relations based on the recognition of rights. And the preamble goes on, convinced that the recognition of the rights of indigenous peoples in this declaration, the UN Declaration, will enhance and promote harmonious and cooperative relations. Well, that's reconciliation, said in a different way. But this is between states and indigenous peoples based on the principles of justice, democracy, respect for human rights, non-discrimination, and good faith. So again, that's a fundamental principle of reconciliation that is in the UN Declaration. So when you go on to ask yourself what other areas of the Declaration are supportive of the Sustainable Development Goals, we look to Article 14, for example, on education and language. Indigenous peoples have the right to establish and control their educational systems and institutions, providing education in their own languages. Providing education in their own languages, because that's where the real knowledge about sustainable development can be caught from the elders. But it has to be in a manner of appropriate to cultural methods of teaching and learning. So our elders are key, and they're supported in Article 14 of the UN Declaration. Article 20 specifically refers to the right to subsistence and development. And again, I quote Article 20 of the Declaration, which states, indigenous peoples have the right to maintain and develop their political, economic, and social systems or institutions to be secure in the enjoyment of their own means of subsistence, our own traditional means of subsistence, whether it's hunting, fishing, trapping, gathering, for example, gather of our medicines, but to be done in a way that's development, and to engage freely in all traditional and other economic activities. So there's a specific article on subsistence and sustainable development based on our traditional knowledge, which we can look to going forward. An important article, Article 18 of the UN Declaration, is on the right to participate in decision making. As I started out by saying, since 1923 to 1948 until 1974, we had no voice. But now we have a right to participate in decision making, which is contained in Article 18 of the UN Declaration. Indigenous peoples have the right to participate in decision making in matters which would affect their rights through representatives chosen by themselves in accordance with their own procedures, as well as to maintain and develop their own indigenous decision-making institutions. So our traditional forms of leadership are still protected in a way, and the elders are going to be an ongoing basis of key to our success going forward further when we ask ourselves, what do we do with these sustainable development goals from our perspective? Expand on the 6 references that are there and indeed use all of the 17 goals. Article 20, Indigenous peoples have the right to maintain and develop their political, economic, and social systems or institutions to be secure in the enjoyment of their own means of subsistence and development, and to engage freely in all their traditional and other economic activities. So it's a repetition in a way, but an important one in terms of sustainable development. And then we come to the treaties, the international standing of treaties in Article 37. And I want to read the clause because there's one word that we ignore too often. Indigenous peoples have the right to the recognition, observance, and here's the key, not only recognition, observance, but enforcement of treaties. And it was expanded, of course, to include agreements and other constructive arrangements concluded with states or their successors like Canada, and to have states honor and respect such treaties, agreements, and other constructive arrangements. And very importantly, those that are concerned that there's a violation of treaties in this work, note that 37.2 says nothing in this declaration may be interpreted as diminishing or eliminating the rights of Indigenous peoples contained in treaties. Violence against Indigenous women and children was referenced in the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples. In fact, Clause 2 of that says, and I quote, states shall take measures in conjunction with Indigenous peoples, again, us working together, to ensure that Indigenous women and children enjoy the full protection and guarantees against all forms of violence and discrimination. And that's Article 22, violence against women and children. And as you know, later on, we added, because sadly they're often ignored, the persons with disabilities. The right to health and traditional health-related practices. Article 24 of the UN Declaration is also one of the Sustainable Development Goals. Indigenous peoples have the right to their traditional medicines and to maintain their health practices, including conservation of their vital medicinal plants, animals, and minerals. So very importantly, the right to health and traditional medicines. And Article 31 talks about in a very substantial way, the traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples, including human genetic resources, seeds, medicines, knowledge, and properties of fauna and flora. And what's lacking here is free, prior, and informed consent for development projects impacting indigenous peoples' lands and resources. But we made sure we inserted it in at least 9 places of the Declaration. And the important one that I want to highlight is Article 32, because it talks about development. And I want to refer to Article 26, because a very important article that says indigenous peoples have the right to the lands, territories, and resources which they have traditionally owned, occupied, or otherwise used and acquired. Because sometimes, sadly, we've had to buy our own land back. But importantly, states, and this is mandatory, states shall give legal recognition and protection to these lands, territories, and resources. Such recognition shall be conducted with due respect to the customs, traditions, and land tenure systems of the indigenous peoples concerned. And you'll know also there's another very important Article 25 that talks about our spiritual relationship to the land. For a long time, many states argued there's no such thing as a right to environment, but we were able to insert Article 29 in the Declaration, which states in paragraph 2, states shall take effective measures to ensure that no storage or disposal of hazardous materials shall take place in the lands or territories of indigenous peoples without their free, prior, and informed consent. And you know that our lands have been severely damaged, for example, through agricultural practices. But the article that's really key in this section is 32. And in first paragraph it states, indigenous peoples have the right to determine and develop priorities and strategies for the development or use of their lands or territories and other resources, which I would say includes waters. States shall consult and cooperate in good faith with indigenous peoples concerned through their own representative institutions, and here's the key, in order to obtain their free, prior, and informed consent prior to the approval of any project affecting their lands or territories and other resources. So this has been controversial, Article 32, because of the notion of development from our perspective and the need to get our consent. And the UN in Article 42, all its bodies, including the Permanent Forum, the expert mechanism, are to be engaged in this implementation. And by concluding, I want to refer to the 9 specific areas of the Sustainable Development Goals. There's 9 major groups, and we're the 9th group, as mentioned, indigenous peoples governments and UN agencies cannot achieve these goals alone. They have to include indigenous peoples and 8 other areas. There was a high-level political forum in July of 2018 in New York, and one of the states that was reviewed then was Canada. And Canada was criticized for being very far behind in the work of the Sustainable Development Goals and promoting them. And in conclusion, I wanted to answer the last question I was asked to address. What about current and future opportunities? Well, in the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples Outcome Document and the Sustainable Development Goals, it specifically states in paragraph 37, we note that Indigenous peoples have the right to determine and develop priorities and strategies for exercising their right to development. In this regard, we commit ourselves, Indigenous peoples, to giving due consideration to all the rights of Indigenous peoples in the elaboration of the post-2015 development agenda. So we need to be proactive in that commitment. Lastly, the Sustainable Development Framework calls on Indigenous peoples, calls on us, and other major groups to engage actively in implementing the Sustainable Development Goals, including in the follow-up and review on the national level to ensure that the progress for Indigenous peoples is reflected. We need to monitor so that there is progress on our behalf, and that will be our obligation going forward. It also calls on states to engage with Indigenous peoples and other major groups to achieve these goals on the country level, in other words, in Canada. So with that, I want to thank you very much for this opportunity to discuss an overview of all the Sustainable Development Goals, how we need to be engaged, how we can be engaged, fulfill those gaps that are still missing, are still there, and then we can have a much more equal economic situation with others. Thank you very much. Hai hai kinanas kumtnao.